I was looking recently at the story of a king called King Saul in the Old Testament in the Bible. The interesting thing about Saul is that he's called to be the king, he's anointed, he's all ready and waiting to form an incredible kingship and something that will have a lasting legacy. And yet it seems that he makes a real mess of it, really. He keeps doing things that are really daft, and he really acts unwisely. He doesn't obey God. He doesn't really work with Samuel the prophet, who's very much God's man in the situation, trying to help mentor him, trying to help guide him forward. And he does some really silly things. And in doing so, we find that King Saul starts to really fall, not so much just out of favor with Samuel, but more importantly, he falls out of favor with God. And it's very interesting that who replaces him? David, King David replaces him. David, who's just been shepherd boy, humble, insignificant, the last of the brothers, and yet God takes hold of his life. And what I find really interesting is, in 1 Samuel chapter 15, it talks about the real death knell of Saul's reign, where God's blessing just leaves him. And the reason is because he just doesn't go with the plan that God has. He doesn't do the things that God has said to do. He does it, he takes it all into his own hands, he does it his way. And it's a great disaster, really. He just doesn't follow the instructions that God gives. And so what happens, Samuel is very grieved by this. Samuel is so upset and finds it so difficult. This was the great plan. This was the guy who was going to be leading God's people, who was going to be laying down a legacy. And it's heartbreaking to see him make such a failure of simple obedience. And David is very opposite. And it's interesting how Samuel, although he's an amazing guy, he notices when he's been told by God to go to the house of Jesse. He notices first the oldest brother. Oh, it says in 1 Samuel 16 verse 6, when they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. In other words, the guy who's obviously strong and a bit of a leader figure, maybe in the family, he's noticeable, and so God says, that's not the person I'm choosing. Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I've rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And interesting, of course, that God says, I've rejected this, the older brother, this guy who seems to have it all. And it's so much like the situation. Saul was a particularly tall guy, quite noticeable, really stood out in the crowd. And yet he didn't really meet the requirements that God had in terms of just following in simple obedience. And what I love about this story in 1 Samuel 16, I just found it really inspiring because David is anointed. He's a guy who's been out there, really in out of sight, not in any sense known and noticed by other people. Very much out tending the sheep, almost forgotten as a possible contender of one of Jesse's sons, who could potentially be king. They really almost forgot that he was there, and yet he's anointed. God says, right, this is the guy, this is the man. And we see in 1 Samuel 16 verse 11, I'll start in verse 10. Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. So he asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? There is still the youngest, Jesse answered. He is tending the sheep. It was almost like an afterthought. Samuel said, send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. And And then God says in verse 12, then the Lord said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. And the Lord came powerfully upon David. And what happens next, I found fascinating. I think it just reminded me, and it just came afresh to me, really, to realize the first thing that happens is that God just opens a door for David to come in quite humbly, serving Saul, who at that time then is tormented by an evil spirit. God's presence has left him. Things are not going well. He's still king, but he's really lost blessing. And what happens is David, who God has anointed and called and is going to become king, but much later on, he then comes into his household, and God's presence on David coming into that situation brings relief, brings peace, brings calm as he plays worship. The heavy evil presence lifts and God's presence comes in. And so it's amazing how God uses this. Rather than David just kind of marching in there and taking over, quite the opposite. David comes in a very kind of undercover way, really, very subtle way. God sends him in, and David isn't forcing the door open. David is called in just to help and to serve with his worship music, really. So it's very interesting how he comes in, and and slowly, bit by bit, he gains credibility, honor, and people recognize his talents, in a sense, not just his musical talents, but also that he's brave, and and as time goes on, his ability in terms of military strength and so on, things like that. And so he keeps serving, and but he serves Saul, and that's the interesting thing. He serves, and then we see in 1 Samuel chapter 17, goes on to the very well-known story of David and Goliath. And what I noticed recently about that is how David's access to the battlefield, the battle line, that situation, the confrontation that comes, it all happens at just the right time, as does his entry into the palace to play to Saul, to play worship music. But the time when he goes and confronts Goliath, it happens at a time when the nation is at a crisis. And how does David get there? Does he kind of like, march up saying, here I'm the man? No, he's actually just sent on an errand to take supplies in and to check on how the brothers are doing. He's still kind of really not noticed. He's not at the front line. He's not the first in the queue. He's not the person people think that he's got it all. He's seen in still quite a despised kind of way. And yet God uses him, and he just says, look, I can help in this. I've dealt with these things before in another context. And so never underestimate when God's called you and anointed you, he'll use you. It might not happen in a dramatic way at first. It might happen in the simple acts of obedience, the simple acts of service. But start small, start humble, start obedient, and that's the way forward. And let God do the rest. Let God promote you. Let God open the doors. Let him do it in his way. Don't worry too much about how it might happen. Just relax and stay obedient in the small things. So bless you, and I pray that be true for all of us, that we find that simple obedience in stepping forward into the things that God calls us to do.